Well, happy Saturday to you. So today, what I'd like to do for the weekend for your homework is because we're kind of running short on time, I'm going to try to do a lesson today on the presidency, on the executive branch this weekend, so that when we get back to class on Monday, we can move forward into a little bit. There's actually going to be a two-part thing. I'm going to try to do this about 15 minutes talking about the roles of the executive, and then about 15 minutes talking about the presidency. So I'll break it up into two parts, and we'll go from there. So hopefully we'll see. I got a clock on, so I'm trying to watch the time here to make sure I keep it to 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. You know me. All right. So, and again, a couple of the classes we already talked about this, but when you look at the executive branch, the Constitution is pretty clear about some constitutional roles that the president has, and then there's roles that have evolved over time that reflect needs that the country's had at different points in times, and it has come out of a role that they needed to serve that perhaps the founders hadn't envisioned. But I want to start by looking at the constitutional roles of the president today. And I think that it's really interesting because we're in an interesting time where the executive branch is, I mean, it's always under scrutiny, but we have a situation now where we're looking at an executive that has expanded in some ways the role of the executive and has changed the traditional role of the executive. And so I'd like you to kind of keep that in mind as we're looking along, for good or bad, and think about sort of the traditional roles that I'm going to try to explain, and then ways that these roles might have and might be presently, literally at this time, changing in under President Trump. So in terms of constitutional role, if you look over here at the chart on the left, and I'm trying to keep the two charts up here just like we do in class. So we've got specifically said, so these are part of expressed in the Constitution. These are powers that are literally laid out, that the president roles that the president is going to fulfill. The first two here, if you see chief of state and chief executive. Now, these are interesting roles because these two roles in many countries are separated into two different parts, and or two separate people. If you think about England, England has the Queen, which serves in one role that we would call the chief of state, but also has a prime minister that is the chief executive. We, under our system and under our constitution, we combined those two so that they are the same person. If you look here on the slide here on the right, you've got ceremonial heads. So you got examples here of Obama. In the top left corner, here's a picture of Obama embracing a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing. He went over for the anniversary of the bombing. Excuse me, it was the 75th anniversary year or two, right? I think he's last year in office. And he went over for the ceremony to honor those who had perished in the bombing. And this is him with one of the survivors. Picture next to it, you've got Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush laying a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. I believe this is in Normandy in France. On the right, top right, is George W. Bush. He, after 9/11, went up within a few days up to the pit that was formerly the World Trade Center, and he stood up on the rubble with the workers trying to find bodies and trying to find survivors, and basically gave a speech from that, because the country at that point was in a crisis mode, and he took on that role to be national unifier. One of the most famous pictures, I think, in all presidential history is the picture on the bottom left. And this is a picture of Ronald Reagan at a very famous speech Ronald Reagan gave. And in the background is a site that you may or may not be familiar with called the Brandenburg Gate. But if you look, there's this blue, almost like a curtain in front of it. That's actually where the wall was, the Berlin Wall. And this is a speech in West Berlin talking to Gorbachev, who was the leader of Soviet Union at the time. And very famous line that came out of that was, "Gorbachev, tear down this wall," in this very famous speech. And then within a few years, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of people sort of credit the beginning of that erosion of faith and confidence, or in the support of the wall. They really point to that moment as being a critical moment. Here you've got President Trump. One of his first meetings was with Prime Minister Netanyahu from Israel. And then on the bottom right is President Johnson awarding a soldier Medal of Honor. So these are all examples that they don't really have a functional purpose, but they serve a very important role in our country as the head of state, sort of that person who represents us to the world. The second part of chief executive is much more complicated. This is the role of the actual sort of where the rubber hits the road. This is where the president has a job. This is where the president has certain functional duties that the president is required to do. Hold on a second, I think I lost my screen there.